All right. Peace and greetings, YouTubers. So, when they see us, this was a lot to unpack, I'll be honest. It was a very hard watch as well. Like, I thought I could be one of those people who's going to just boss it up and binge through all 4 episodes. I was like, nah. After 2 episodes, I had to turn it off and come back to it the next day because I was ready to punch somebody in the back of the face watching that. So, but the reason I was excited about this series coming out was because it gives everybody a chance to see the victims humanized. You know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of times when things happen to black people, especially things that are violent or moments when we get killed or there's something unjust that happens to us, society always says there's something we must have done to make that thing happen to us. So, when Trayvon Martin got killed, there must have been something he had done to deserve to die. When Tamir Rice got killed, when the police showed up and shot him in 2 seconds, well, must have been something he had done. When, Ayanna Jones got killed for sleeping in her bed because there was a police raid while they were trying to shoot the first 48 hours and then she got killed, must have been something she had done. Maybe she wasn't in the right place at the right time. When they had the Move bombing where they just dropped the whole bomb on the city block over in Philly, it must have been something the people have done. That's always been the narrative because a lot of times, if we're being very honest, America has no sympathy or empathy when it comes to any kind of trauma that happens to black people as a collective or individually. So this was a great way to kind of see the experience through the lens of those who lived it. There's been a really great documentary that came out a few years before, but even then, there were so many naysayers who still were like, no, these kids did it. As a matter of fact, something that kind of triggered me, which I was going to kind of put at the end of the video, but I'll address it now, is there was definitely recently, either it was a 48 Hours or Dateline or 2020, one of them shows, and it was on last week or the week before where they were actually talking about this case. And you still have the detectives and a lot of police officials and people who worked on that case as far as being a part of the prosecution still trying to push the narrative that these kids raped this white woman. And that these kids, why are we feeling sorry for them? Why are they being rewarded? Why are they getting documentaries and movies and big giant settlements and everything like that? They were pushing the narrative that, the reason they settled was because they knew they were going to lose. So like I said, there's not a lot of empathy and sympathy for the plight of black trauma in this country. And so I'm glad that this series did come out because it gives people an opportunity to see what exactly happens when people go through this. And not just the aspect of just being incarcerated or falsely accused, but everything as far as the full circle experience, how it affects your family, how it affects your livelihood, how it affects your mind, how it affects your life afterwards, and how do you put the pieces back together. It's all of that. So I thought they did a really great job. I'm not going to spend too much time actually reviewing the series. I'm going to just really say my 2 cents on everything. But for the first 2 minutes, let me talk the series. Because really, I didn't watch this for entertainment. You know what I mean? Because it's still real life, and it's still a lot of the issues that are happening today mirror what happened then, and not much has changed in society. So I didn't watch this as, to be a critic and, they didn't have good lighting on this scene, and, they could have had a better actor to play. Yeah, I think that's beside the point. So, as far as the overall movie, I thought they did a great job. The acting, the individual who played Korey, I forgot his name, but that he played that role very, very well. That very last episode, and there are some spoilers in here. And like I said, it's not a movie, so I don't know what I can really spoil because this is real life. But he was phenomenal in how he played the role. I think pretty much the entire cast, it was casted very well. I think they did a great job of capturing the emotional experience that the victims would face in the moments that they had during that film. So I think that those were the highlights. You definitely, it digs into your emotional appeals. I'm not gonna lie, I was teared up and choked up in a lot of scenes because I was so pissed off watching it. And I was like, man, it's a lot to sit through. If you're somebody who can't take a lot of trauma or anything that really psychologically just messes with you, you can't really sit through all this in one sitting. You need to take a break, and then you got to go do something positive afterwards. So just something to kind of balance out that energy, because you don't want to go to bed with something like this on your heart. But anyway, getting into the actual story, like I said, the humanizing aspect is where they struck gold. And because really, it's only like a 6-hour type series, but the thing I always thought about is, we only watched 6 hours, and it was tough to sit through. Imagine living that for decades, or being in a prison for 14 years. That 6 hours was painful enough, but picture 14 years of that kind of nonsense. And the first thing I kept thinking of was the psychological damage that experience would have done to those individuals, especially when you're talking about, I believe it was Antoine, whose father pretty much walked out. That alone, just it kind of got to me to an aspect. But really, when we're talking about the psychological damage, like when people experience these kind of things, I think we always just associate being incarcerated with being locked down physically. But in those moments, mentally, you're also incarcerated. You don't have the freedom to just have free think and free will or anything, because your entire mind is trapped in a cloud of shoulda, coulda, woulda, and what if, and what did I do wrong, and how do I manage in this environment that I'm in. And you saw that with the experience of the different characters and all that they had to go through. There were so many things that were psychologically traumatizing to experience. And so when you're talking about Antoine and how his father pretty much walked out, and I say that alone, it carried so much weight, because when you think about the role of your father, if you're fortunate enough to have a male figure in your life that's a father figure, or if it's your father, your grandfather, your uncle, a big brother, a cousin, a step parent, a foster parent, somebody who is taking care of you, that male aspect in your life. As a child, that role that your father serves is that sense of security, just like how your mother is that sense of nurturing, and they can kind of intertwine and switch back and forth. But really, that sense of security that you get from your father. Like me as a child, I remember when I was like really little, like 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9, my father used to work late sometimes, so he didn't get home until sometimes 9, 10, 11 o'clock. And I didn't feel safe in the house until Dad got home, mainly because my mom spent so much time watching Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted, so I always thought there was a psycho killer in the neighborhood. And I wouldn't feel safe until Dad got home, And it's not even just physical safety. It's like, I remember the very first time I went on a roller coaster, I was terrified. I didn't want to get on it. It was Space Mountain at Disneyland, and I didn't want to get on it, but my dad was like, "You had me waiting this line for 2 hours. Are we getting on this ride?" Because I thought Space Mountain was like a store. It looked like the house from the Jetsons when I saw it. So I was like, "Oh, let's go there." And then I was like, "Oh, shoot, this is a roller coaster. I don't want to get on this." And anyway, I was terrified of being on the ride. But the only thing that kept me sane was I was sitting next to my dad. So internally I knew, well, if Dad is good, I'm good. You know what I mean? And that's the role our fathers play in our lives, or any kind of male figure that you grow up with, if you're fortunate enough to have one, is that sense of security. And so when you look at what Antoine had to experience, he didn't get that. So just picture him being in that interrogation, and he's sitting there, and finally he sees his father and his mother. For him, he's probably thinking, finally, what is my norm, or my feeling of normalcy is here. I'm gonna be okay. Dad is here to come and protect me. And unfortunately, it didn't happen because they've already gotten to the father. They pretty much lied, because this is the bigger issue, is just the police and the lying and the manipulation and the corruption just to get a charge and get a conviction by any means necessary. They had gotten to the father. So imagine this kid waiting for his father to come in and save him, and father then flipped the switch and said, "No, you need to tell them what you did, so we can go home, because they were told, confess to this and you'll be a witness. You're not going to be going to jail, but you'll be the witness to this case. So just say what we want to hear." And the father's endorsing this, tell them what they want to hear. And for him, he's saying, okay, if my father's telling me this, that means I know I'm going to be okay. That means I know I have nothing to worry about, because my dad's not going to let anything happen to me. And so you see what happens. And no, they get charged, and he goes to jail, and then there's the trial, and then it only gets worse because the father kind of pulls out. It's already too much for the dad, because I'm sure the dad probably dealt with something similar to the aspect of understanding what it's like to be a black man dealing with the judicial system and dealing with policing and the court system and all of that. And for him, it was already psychologically damaging enough for the father. And the father's thinking about his career and everything else like that. And literally, you watch the father go from a role of being the alpha male, secure, take care of my family type guy, to being broken down to just like being a kid, to being a teenager. Literally, as I watched it, I saw the father in the same space that I saw Antoine. I saw them switch roles. I saw the father go from being the father to pretty much being a boy, unsure of himself, insecure, in an inferiority complex, and afraid. And so you see that happen. And so as the case happens, the father is not there. And then when the father gets on the stand, he gets manipulated the same way, just by the verbiage of how the prosecution presented everything, with them giving a bunch of leading questions. If you ever study law, you already know, like, leading questions are usually, they would get kind of, you can object a leading question, but pretty much that's how they coerced the father and tricked him with the verbiage and everything. And before you know it, the father's testimony worked against the son. So now the person that you're looking at, who is your sense of security, has pretty much played a role into you going to jail. By you putting your trust into father, who was supposed to help you out, and you put your trust into what he said, because he also believed that doing what they said would get his son out, because he just wants his son back. Look how everything worked full circle. And so then by the time Antoine gets out of jail, now his father's sick. So Antoine never gets that experience of having those layers of security from your father, that layer of security from when you're a child and your father keeps you safe and you feel that you're always good with your father. Because I know when I was little, I knew if I was with my dad, I was always good, because dad could fight. So I knew we could go anywhere, dad was going to have my back. That aspect of your father having your back. Antoine didn't get that. And even the aspect of, as you get older, your father teaching you how to drive, your father teaching you, about different things when it comes to dating and everything like that, the co-signing for the apartment and teaching you everything about leasing and the credit cards and when you get your first child and all of that. Antoine got none of that because by the time he gets out, dad is sickly and dad is on the way out. And so now, unfortunately for Antoine, he has to look past the voids that are missing and go straight to forgiveness mode because his dad only has so much time left on the earth. That's some psychological damage there. That's things that people don't think about when you're talking about their experience. For the prosecution and the naysayers and the Donald Trumps and the people who said, oh, death penalty to these kids, like, people don't think about the long-term aspects of what also happens to people when these things happen, when people are falsely accused of something. And so that was very stressful to sit through. And so when we're talking about also just the manipulation that they had with the kids, it was just traumatizing to witness because the kids sat in interrogation for hours upon hours upon hours. They didn't get any food. You saw they were getting beat up and slapped around and everything. The only thing they got was some sodas on occasion, a soda here and there. And the soda was a reward for finally saying what they wanted you to say. And so as you're watching the different tapes, because if you've actually seen the actual documentary, if you could just go back and you read the transcripts of what was being said in the interrogations and you just look at the old clips of the interrogations, they're pretty much coaching the kids to say everything they need to say and everything like that. And that's why the kids, their stories kept shifting and changing and nothing made sense, nothing added up. And I think that's the worst part, is knowing that the police lied and just didn't care. Knowing that there was no physical evidence, there was nothing, but they were like, well, we need to make something work. And they just kept going with it. And so it's crazy. There's a scene in there where you see they get the picture of the boy who gets punched in the face by the police. And they use that picture in a different interrogation with another kid and says, how did this kid get the scratches on his face? Meanwhile, it's because the police officer punched him, but they said, well, let's use the narrative as the woman attacked him while he was, or fought him off as he was attacking her. So getting those kids to turn against each other, because if, you look at the origin, pretty much, long story short, for anybody who's unfamiliar with what exactly I'm talking about, when you're talking about the Central Park 5 case, it's just, there's a random white woman who gets brutally attacked and raped in Central Park. And there's kids who happen to be out in the area because it's New York City, it's Harlem, it's Manhattan, it's all of that, live metropolis, lots of things going on. The police pretty much just start rounding up kids. And eventually they just kind of just frame some kids for the actual attack and the assault. And so when you're looking at the Central Park 5, the majority of those kids didn't even know each other, never even heard of each other. May have seen each other in passing, but they weren't friends, they didn't go to the same schools, anything like that. And so now they've been, put in a position to turn on each other, which for them wouldn't have been hard to go and make up a lie about somebody you don't know if you've been in an interrogation for 14, 15, 16 hours and you just want to go home. And so you're willing to say any and everything just to get out of there, especially if it's some kids you haven't heard of. So if they're saying, oh, this person did it, just say that they did it. Oh, yeah, they did it too. I'm ready to go home. Like that, it's so easy to coerce children to do a lot of things. I remember one time, because I do work with kids, I had this teenager who, they're always forgetful. I swear it's an Aries thing. Like, people who are Aries always forget stuff all the time. But she was an Aries and she would always leave her stuff all around. And so I'd always get on her because she'd leave her cell phone everywhere. And I'm like, you can't leave your cell phone laying around because people are not always honest. And so one day we were on this field trip with the little kids and she was one of my helper, chaperone type people. And she left the cell phone on the park bench. So me and my coworker were like, grab the cell phone, let's hide it and act like it's missing. Maybe they'll figure it out and everything like that. So for 30 minutes, we're like, she's freaking out because she can't find her phone. And we're telling the kids, well, reward for whoever can figure out what happened to the phone. In 30 minutes, these kids on this bus then turned on each other and they're saying this person stole it and that person stole it. And the best thing was, I had one kid who made up a whole person. Was like, I saw somebody, because while we were at the lake, I saw somebody go in the bus and they took it and they took the phone. And me and my coworker were looking like, you know what? Okay. Wow. So of course when we pulled the phone out, here's your phone. We had it the whole time. It was interesting just to see the looks on the kids' faces. It's so easy to get kids to pretty much buy into something if you coerce them enough. And so that's pretty much what the police did. And it's absolutely crazy. And I think that the story that I think really digs at everybody was Korey's situation. All of them had horrible situations, but I think because they spent an hour on Korey, Korey just, the fact that he wasn't even at the park, the fact that he was just hanging with his other friend, and he was invited to go to the interrogation with the friend. Oh, we'll be back. Yeah, you come with your friend. Go ahead. And he just wanted to be a supportive friend. And it seems like he ended up getting it the worst. It just, he was sick. Well, he was 15, but by the time the trial and everything happened, he was 16. So he was tried as an adult. They sent him to Rikers Island, same place where they sent Khalif Broder. We've had that conversation about Khalif. And even when we go back to the psychological trauma, we saw what happened with Khalif in the end. Even though he was let out and everything like that, he never was able to recover, and he's no longer here. All because there was an assumption that he stole a backpack, which wasn't true. And because they couldn't afford the bail, he just had to sit in jail, and he sat in jail for 3 years because they never started the trial. And they put him in Rikers and put him in solitary and everything like that. And by the time he got out, I think he was 19 when he got out, he wasn't able to matriculate through society. The world was just a foreign place to him. He couldn't be himself, and he's no longer here. And so when you look at Korey's case just, even when it was leading to it, the craziest part is I already knew everything that was going to happen, but as I was watching it happen, when you saw the police, because their case was starting to fall apart because one of the parents had already, I think Yusef Salam's mom had pulled her son out like, nope, I think not. So that son never confessed to doing anything. And then you had another kid who was already sent home, and so the case was falling apart, and they said, well, we need one more kid. And Korey just happened to still be sitting in the precinct waiting for his friend to come out, and next thing you know, they're interrogating Korey. Like, that was the worst one, because I also understand, like, Korey also, he just processed things a little differently. I don't know if he had a learning disability or what his full case was, but clearly he just did things a bit differently. And they were aware of that. They caught on to that, and they used that against him. So, in addition to the beating and holding them against their will for all those hours and hours and pretty much making them convince themselves that they've done something they haven't, like, you just look at how they pretty much tricked this kid and how you're able to get somebody who wasn't even at the scene of where any of this happened. And mind you, none of these kids were at the scene of where the sexual assault happened. It happened a whole half mile up from where they were at, but because they just happened to be at the park, it was collateral. Anybody who was black and a teenager, you just locked, or Afro-Latino, you just snatched up and locked away anyway. To see how they just pretty much manipulated this kid. His tape is the hardest one to watch. If you go and you watch the real interrogations, it's the most painful thing to watch because he clearly doesn't understand what's going on. And on top of that, he's literally getting yelled at the whole time. And not yelled at as in you're going to be in trouble. Like, yelled at as in we're about to kick you, we're going to beat you, you about to get some more. Like, he's terrified in the video. He doesn't understand what's being asked of him. They're using terms and phrases he can't quite understand and decipher. And it's just making him even more confused. And they have different people coming in and going and coming in and going. Then finally they bring in, I think it was Elizabeth they bring in. Either Elizabeth, no, it was Linda Feinstein, who's still working today, I believe, in the same field. They bring her in because, of course, you bring in the white woman with the soft speaking voice. Maybe you might be a little bit more apt to trying to cooperate, and that's exactly what they tried to do with him. So they brought her in there, and she does the whole soft speaking thing because she's the soft, fragile, nurturing woman who can help you get out of this. And next thing you know, now he's talking about how he sexually assaulted a woman that he's never seen before. All right, and the interesting part is all 5 of the stories, none of the stories added up. The stories didn't make sense. Nothing, they didn't have the description of what the woman had on correctly. They didn't have the right location where the assault took place. As far as what they did with the assault, it didn't add up. Like, it's just like, dang, and y'all still trying to push this case? Y'all really just pushed it, huh? And so you see Korey and just going through all the different jail, the transfers and everything. And the fact that he volunteered to go into solitary confinement goes to show you how terrible it had to be while he was in the jail or in the prison. Because with solitary confinement, the hardest aspect of it is, one, you're secluded from everybody. You may be cool for that first week in there by yourself, but over time, you start to lose a sense of who you are. You don't know what day it is. You don't know what time it is. You haven't had communication with anybody. You start becoming delusional. You get into a space where you no longer fit in within society, and the longer that you're in there, the harder it is for you to snap back into your actual realm of what is considered normal for you, when you get out. And he was in there for years. And I mean, he just went from prison to prison in solitary confinement. You had the in-house politics going on within the prison. That's another thing. When you talk about the judicial system, it's not just the crooked police. It's not just the bad judicial system and the rulings in the courts and all of that. But it's also what happens in the prisons and how a lot of these prison guards are not held accountable. I personally think the prison guard sexually assaulted him. I think that's what he kept alluding to in the movie, talking about, let me know if there's anything you can do for me, over and over. Like, I definitely think he was sexually assaulted by at least a prison guard. But you saw everything that kept happening to him. He already had a lot going on at home, plus the fact that mom was already kind of back and forth with what she was dealing with. So it's like, that's an experience. And I guess what really gets me as well is how they kept wanting him to admit guilt in order to get parole, because that's how parole operates. You don't get parole unless you acknowledge your guilt. And the reason why I think they do that, that's insurance. So if somebody tries to sue the police department afterwards, if they, say they get out or whatever happens, the police are just going to use that and say, nope, because you confessed to it right here, so you could get out. That was the agreement you have. You don't have a case. So go on back to your life where you try to figure out how to make it with a felony. Good luck. Because if we want to be transparent about the judicial system in this country, we know that 90% of the people who are in prison right now are in prison under a plea agreement. That doesn't mean that they are guilty of the crime that they admitted to doing. They just recognize that the risk and consequence of going to trial and being found guilty, even if they were actually not guilty at heart, the consequence was greater than that of just going ahead and admitting to something you didn't do for a lighter sentence. It just made more sense to just go ahead and listen, if I do this, I'll only be in jail for a year or two and I'll get probation, as opposed to facing 20 years. And so that aspect of manipulation and coercion, and just the fact that there was no element of humanity with how they work with these kids. Like they just didn't care. It was just anything goes. Let's just go ahead and get these kids to confess so we can call it a day and we have another case under our belt. Like, that's the jacked up part. It reminds me, I've told this story before for those who follow me. I had a cousin who they slipped and fell playing basketball when they were younger, and it messed up how they were able to understand things because they like really busted their head open and everything like that. And so there was a situation that happened with my cousin and a few other teenagers, and long story short, because my cousin was the one who really wasn't able to process information the same anymore, they pretty much made my cousin the guinea pig and the scapegoat for everything because he didn't really know how to properly defend himself. And so pretty much while he was in the interrogation for everything that happened, by the time his parents finally got there, he had already signed a plea deal, already signed everything, admitted to something he didn't even do because he was so afraid of spending the rest of his life in jail like they told him, and he ended up going to jail for 3 years for something he didn't even do. And then he didn't even want to fight it. And something I learned, depending on where you live, you have to pay to be in jail. Like, pay. There's like a fee. Like, he ended up in the Fairfax County Jail until they sent him to the actual prison. It was like $1 a day fee. I was like, that's crazy. And the other thing is, you have to pay that fee whether you're guilty or not. And that's also a separate. It just goes to show how the judicial system in the prison industrial complex, it's just a crazy operation, because if you're somebody who's not in an affluent position and just pay those kind of bills back, or say you get out, maybe you don't have family support and now you have to figure out how to get a job and everything, but of course you're a convicted felon, there's no jobs for you. If you don't pay that money back, what do you think happens? What do you think the ultimate consequence is in the long run if you're not able to adequately pay everything back within a timely manner? Like, they will get you caught up. It's absolutely crazy. But again, like, there's so many people who still, it's disturbing that there's so many people who still really think that these kids did this. And another aspect is, like, when you just talk about the whole divide and conquer mentality, like, that's literally the only reason why all of them ended up in jail. Like, literally, they confessed because they were told that another person told on them. That goes back to that manipulation aspect. They know that you can use divide and conquer to get people to work against each other. And they've always done that with black folks as a collective. Okay, that's exactly how they were able to break apart the Black Panther movement. That's exactly how they were able to kind of break apart, the black nationalist movement. As far as COINTELPRO, that's how things have always been. Just get into the heads of everybody, make everybody fight each other. And so if you think about it, the four of them all told on each other and ended up including the fifth person just because they were told another person told on them. Absolutely crazy. And so they all pretty much worked against each other thinking it would help them get out, and it just made things worse. And so that's how things always end up working. I'm telling you, that Elizabeth and that Linda lady, the fact that there was just no empathy, no sympathy, they didn't care. It's just they had an MO and they were going by any means necessary to get it. And even today, especially that Linda Feinstein lady, she's still, even as recently as a week or two ago, is still claiming, well, all five of them were involved, and the new person whose DNA was found, who was the reason they got off, he was just the sixth person. She's gonna stick with that and run with it because she would rather just be right than to, and I'm talking about right as far as her perspective, than to be right as far as what's actually right. She's gonna look out for her own. Like, that's some jacked up stuff, but people will do that. That's how white supremacy works. People will vote against their own interests and everything just to be right in the aspect of protecting the identity of whiteness, because white supremacy is always gonna be protected by whiteness. It's always gonna be protected by the aspect of keeping things the way they are so some people can have somewhat of a decent life. And even those who may not tangibly have anything, who still share that white skin, for them it's like, at least we have power because we have this. At least we're not black. That's the perception. That would be my only reasoning as to why some people vote the way they vote when they vote against candidates that have all of their interests. But they recognize that they don't mind suffering a little bit if the people who they feel that they are above suffer a bit more. Like, that's some crazy stuff, ain't it? But anyway, somebody was also saying, you always bring everything about race. It's not even blah, blah, blah. And as a matter of fact, some of the jurors on there were black. And I'm like, can we go back to the aspect of the time that this took place? Now, this is 1989 going into 90 and 91. You have to look at what was going on when it came to the black image. This was the time period of peak visibility when it came to giving crappy images of black Americans. All right, so one, it's still the crack era. The crack epidemic is still going on, and now you also have the AIDS thing going on. And with the crack epidemic, this is the same time period where you had the president of the United States, George Bush #1, sit there and do that address to the union, or address the nation, where he was talking about, the crack that was sold right here outside of the White House. We have a big issue in the war on drugs, this, that, and third. He was holding a bag of crack. And then it turned out that all of that was a setup, and they set somebody up on purpose just so they would have this news story. Like, there was purposely an effort to push out a false narrative about how violent, how aggressive, how dangerous black people were at the time. And in addition to that, you also had a shift in what was being put in media. So you had TV shows like Cops and crime mystery shows where you started seeing that imaging of good guys versus bad guys being put out there. And then when you're talking about the location, all right, this is New York. New York in the late 80s going into the early 90s did not have the best representation. For a lot of people, New York looked like a very dangerous place. And a lot of times they would use images of the Bronx, because the Bronx had just came out of the burning era. The Bronx were no longer burning, but there was no investment into the area. So when you had all those landlords that burned down all their properties in the late 70s, early 80s so they could get the insurance money and the insurance claims, and then they moved on out and called it a day, the neighborhoods were just left destitute, left with no investment. So of course crime starts to rise, but that would be the face of New York when they wanted to show black people. All right. Now, if they wanted to show the other aspect, they'd give you the Donald Trump imaging. They'd give you the Barbara Walters skating, ice skating in whatever little park that is over there. Like, that was the imaging. So the imaging of blackness was kind of under attack at that point. And it didn't help, like, gangster rap came out at the time. So an art form that was pretty much trying to showcase to Americans who didn't live in certain neighborhoods what it was like to walk in the shoes of people who lived in certain areas around the country. That narrative of protest against police brutality and the wealth gap and what was going on in the community, and the fact that for some people selling drugs was the only way to support yourselves because there were no jobs in the community because the liquor store wasn't hiring. They turned that art form into, okay, it's these people corrupting the children, and they're all misogynistic, and they all want the kids to do drugs, and they're all cop killers. And so you had that imaging going out there, and people were terrified of black folks if we really want to go there. This is right before Rodney King was about to happen. This is right before the LA riots was about to happen. So America was already in a very unstable place when it came to race. There was a lot of nonsense going on, and the Reaganomics, the effects of Reaganomics were going on. So you saw a lot of black people in some really crappy situations. And so when you take that aspect, and then you dig into the emotional appeals of the juror, you can get them to believe anything, because what they did with the case, if you watched it and you noticed in the movie, or if you just followed the actual case, you saw that what they did was they dehumanized the boys. They took out any elements of humanity out of them and made them beastly. And they put all of the humanity and empathy onto the victim of the rape crime. And so, they would show her pictures of what would happen with the damage. And, she had to walk into the courtroom, and it took her 50 minutes to get to her seat because, she couldn't walk the same way anymore. She couldn't talk the same way anymore. And they made sure she was dressed a certain way, and they had the long, flowing blonde hair. And then even Elizabeth, while she was doing her questioning, the tone of how she asked her questions changed. It wasn't her cussing out the kids anymore. Now it was a soft tone. And can you remember what happened that night? Can you and all of that played a role because it digs into the emotional appeals of the juror. If you're ever somebody who's into law, your main goal in order to get the jury on your side is dig into their emotional appeals. And the best way to do that is to get them to see things through your lens and to get them to feel something, whether it's angry or sad or scared or afraid. And they were successfully able to get the jury angry and pissed off at the kids and empathetic towards the woman's struggle, to the point where even though there was no physical evidence tying these kids to that case, the atrocities that happened to her were so bad that, like I said, they were able to just go ahead and associate that with the kids. Because at that time in America, unfortunately, and honestly, I feel like it could still happen today, it was easier for people to believe that 5 random teenagers would go and rape this random white woman in a park and literally almost kill her and everything like that than it was to believe that the NYPD would frame 5 teenagers for a rape because they didn't do the proper research and they weren't detail-oriented enough and they didn't have the follow-through and they pretty much dropped the ball on the case, but because they already screwed up and they already had somebody, they just kept going with it so that they could be right. It was easier to believe that the kids will go ahead and do such an offense as opposed to believing that the NYPD, who were protecting everybody from all the bad guys, would do such a thing. So you had people go, and of course you had people at the same time there was so much going on where you had like people who were like, enough is enough. Enough was enough with the crime and what's happening in our neighborhoods and what's happening with this. And so they needed to make an example out of somebody. So the jury had no problem locking all them kids up. It didn't matter what race the juror was. They, unfortunately, because everybody was not in that same mindset. And this is before the days of social media. This is before the days of, if the news media is putting out a false narrative, social media can correct it in 5 minutes. Not even in 280 characters. In one tweet. Change the narrative. This was back when you got your sources of information from the newspapers and the news media, and that was it. And Donald Trump could take his $85,000 and put out his, why the kids should be sent to death and everything like that. And people bought into that because people still trusted the news media at the time. People looked at that as the say-all-be-all. If you were on CNN, if you were on ABC News, then that means it had to be official. It had to be the way they said it happened. And so there's that. That's why I always enjoyed that clip of Farrakhan lightning to Mike Wallace when he said that stuff about Nigeria. I always enjoyed watching that because I know people, because he said that line, I've been there, I said it's the most corrupt nation in the world. And Farrakhan was, what? It was like, it's always an interesting clip to watch. But anyway, yeah, so you had a lot of people who just felt like, yeah, it's easier to go ahead and convict these kids because it's harder to believe that the NYPD would frame them than it is to believe that they, wouldn't rape this woman. And that's something that's scary because it goes back to the imaging of the black man and the black youth. And they do this with black women as well, but at this time, because it's black men against the white woman, we know that dynamic that was always pushed, that because if you go back to like the movie, The Original Birth of a Nation, where it's these black monsters who are trying to go and rape the virtuous, innocent Christian white women. Like that's kind of, it's that same narrative. Or if we talk about, people like to use the imaging from, what's the big giant monkey? It's not Godzilla. It's, I can't even think of the money. The movie I'm talking about, the big movie with the big giant ape and you got the white woman in the hand. That movie. Same imaging kind of thing. It's all of that. And so this was that time period for this peak visibility for a crappy black image. That was that time period. So it was very easy to buy into that. I'm gonna wrap this up because I'm talking forever in a day, but like just absolutely crazy. And then the other thing I was gonna say, this part that makes it scary is that you're happy that they were able to be the exception, that they were able to, come above everything that happened to them, and they did get a settlement, which I don't think was high enough. But, what about the ones who don't get that luxury? What about the ones whose stories we're never going to hear? The ones who've already died from old age or execution or whatever, or the ones whose story is just not going to get out there. Like, because this stuff is still happening. It doesn't change anything. And a lot of people have been saying, well, I don't get why we're still making a hoopla about this. They got like $41 million. And again, money doesn't buy your way into liberation when you're living in a capitalistic society, because at the end of the day, money is just the entity that still runs that system. You can't buy your way out of oppression in this country, no matter how rich you are. Like, as crazy as Kanye is now, he had a line where he said that bit, if you buy a Benz, you still a you-know-what. So, at the end of the day, like, people have to eventually get to a point to recognize that money is not, it doesn't equate to freedom and liberation. And I'm talking liberation of the mind and physically, which is why I was a little annoyed with the way that some people responded to my 2 cents I had on Steve Harvey, but I'll address that in another video. But again, like, just because they got $41 million, that doesn't take away from everything else they missed out on. You know what I mean? It doesn't take away from the fact that everything here, just the whole experience is different. That's some crap I wouldn't want anybody to have to experience. But anyway, like I said, it was a good watch. Definitely check it out if you can. You might have to watch it in breaks and do what you need to do to make sure that you're still good here. But yeah, I'm going to do a bunch of videos this week because I'm finally back. I told you I was traveling for a little bit, and then my mother came to visit me, and I just want to take a little mini break, but I'm here now. By the way, my album's out. For those who don't know, all self-produced. It's on all digital music outlets, called The Hardcover, under the name Calvin Michaels. Check it out when you get a chance. Anyway, share your 2 cents on this documentary, and we will catch up. All right, I'm out.